The police officer's body cam footage shows it all. His hands are shaking as he pushes open the barn door in rural Kentucky. The smell hits him first, rotten and sweet, like death wrapped in something worse. When his flashlight cuts through the darkness, he freezes. 17 people, all standing in a perfect circle, not moving, not blinking, just staring at the camera with eyes that shouldn't exist on human faces. Some have features so compressed, so wrong, that his mind can't process what he's seeing. In the center of the circle stands a man in white robes, his own face bearing the unmistakable signs of severe inbreeding. His voice echoes through the barn, calm and certain. "Officer, you're interrupting the birth of God's chosen race." That footage from September 2019 would later be sealed by court order. What happened in Hollow Ridge, Kentucky, wasn't just a crime. It was something that would make investigators question everything they thought they knew about religious extremism, genetic manipulation, and how far human beings will go when they believe God is speaking directly to them. Before we dive into this disturbing true story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're covering the darkest, most mysterious cases that news channels won't touch. This story contains disturbing themes involving genetic disorders and abuse. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Now, let's uncover the horrifying truth about Hollow Ridge. Hollow Ridge wasn't always a place of nightmares. Back in 1987, it was just another dying coal town in eastern Kentucky. Population barely 300, where everyone knew everyone and outsiders were noticed immediately. The local Baptist church sat at the center of town, a small white building with a crooked steeple that had weathered 100 years of Appalachian storms. For decades, it had been the heart of the community, the place where births, deaths, and everything in between were marked and mourned. Then Samuel Creech came home. Samuel had left Hollow Ridge 15 years earlier, just another young man escaping the coal mines for something better. His family said he'd gone to Bible college in Tennessee. What they didn't know was that Samuel had spent most of those years drifting through fringe religious communes across the South, absorbing increasingly radical theology from groups that mainstream Christianity had long ago rejected. He'd been kicked out of 3 different compounds for preaching doctrines so extreme, so focused on genetic purity and divine bloodlines, that even cult leaders found him dangerous. But when Samuel returned to Hollow Ridge in early 1988, none of that mattered. The town was desperate. The coal mine had closed. Young people were leaving in droves. The old pastor had died, and the church was about to close its doors forever. Samuel stepped in, volunteering to lead services for free. He was charismatic, passionate, and he spoke about God with an intensity that made people believe he'd truly found something the rest of the world had lost. At first, his sermons were orthodox enough. He talked about faith, community, resilience in hard times. People started coming back to church. Within 6 months, Samuel had revitalized the congregation. He started a food bank. He helped families behind on their rent. He seemed like an answer to prayer, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, his message began to change. It started with Genesis. Samuel became obsessed with the early chapters, particularly the descendants of Adam and Eve. In service after service, he'd pound the pulpit and ask the same question: how did humanity multiply if not through family? He'd point to the biblical patriarchs, how Abraham married his half sister Sarah, how the tribes of Israel often married within their own bloodlines. God's chosen people kept their blood pure. He'd preach, his voice rising. They didn't dilute what God had made perfect. Most of the congregation dismissed it as just interesting Bible study. But a core group of about 15 families, the ones most desperate for meaning in their collapsed economy, started listening more carefully. These were people who'd lost everything: their jobs, their futures, their sense of purpose. Samuel offered them something powerful: The idea that their suffering was actually a test, and that they were chosen for something greater. By 1990, Samuel had established what he called the covenant community within the larger church. This inner circle met separately, studied different texts, and began following increasingly strict rules. They withdrew their children from public school, homeschooling them with curriculum Samuel personally designed. They stopped socializing with people outside the group. They sold their properties and pooled their money into a collective fund that Samuel controlled, and then Samuel received what he called the revelation. According to the testimony later given to investigators, it happened during a 3-day prayer retreat in the fall of 1991. Samuel emerged claiming that God had spoken to him directly, showing him visions of a new human race, a people so genetically pure, so close to Adam's original perfection, that they would be immune to sin itself. The key, Samuel said, was in the blood. Just as dog breeders created superior animals through careful, selective breeding within bloodlines, God wanted his chosen people to do the same. We've been taught that inbreeding is wrong, Samuel preached to his inner circle. But that's Satan's lie to prevent God's people from achieving their destiny. The genetic problems we see, the deformities and diseases, those only happen when faith is weak. But when God guides the union, when it's done in purity and obedience, the children will be perfect. More than perfect. They will be the next stage of human evolution, the people who will inherit the earth when Christ returns. It was insane. It was evil. But to people who'd been conditioned for years to trust Samuel's interpretation of Scripture, people who desperately wanted to believe they were chosen for something special, it made a terrible kind of sense. The first marriages within the covenant community were between cousins. Samuel performed the ceremonies himself in secret, never filing official marriage licenses. He quoted Scripture, twisted and reinterpreted, to justify each union. When children were born, he'd examine them carefully for any signs of genetic disorders. If the children appeared healthy, he declared it proof that God was blessing the unions. If they showed problems, and several early children did, he claimed the parents hadn't had enough faith, had harbored secret sins that corrupted the bloodline. By 1995, the covenant community had become completely isolated from the outside world. They'd moved from the church building to a compound on Samuel's family's old property, 70 acres of wooded hills far from the main road. The families built small cabins, sharing resources and living communally. To anyone driving past, it looked like a simple religious commune, strange but not necessarily dangerous. Kentucky had dozens of such groups. What was happening inside, though, was beyond comprehension. Samuel had developed what he called the sacred genealogy, a complex chart that tracked the bloodlines of every member of the community. He'd spent years researching his followers' family histories, going back generations, identifying genetic traits he considered blessed. He claimed that certain families carried what he called the Adam gene, a divine genetic marker that made them ideal for his breeding program. The program worked like this. Samuel arranged marriages within increasingly close family relationships. First cousins, then uncles and nieces, eventually siblings. He determined who would marry whom based on his genealogical charts and what he claimed were divine instructions. No one could marry without his permission. No one could refuse a match he'd ordained. Girls as young as 14 were married off to relatives. The legal authorities had no idea because no official marriages were recorded, no birth certificates filed. The community had completely disconnected from the state system. When pressed about the young age of brides, Samuel would quote Old Testament examples, claiming that modern age restrictions were governmental overreach that violated religious freedom. The children born from these unions told the story Samuel didn't want outsiders to see. By the late 1990s, the compound had 37 children, and nearly half showed signs of genetic disorders. Some had cleft palates, others had club feet or missing fingers. Several had intellectual disabilities. 3 children were born blind. 2 had severe skeletal deformities that left them unable to walk. But Samuel had an explanation for everything. The healthy children, he said, proved the program was working. The children with problems were tests of faith, special souls chosen by God to teach the community about sacrifice and unconditional love. He quoted the story of Job, claiming that suffering was part of God's perfect plan. The parents of disabled children were told they should feel honored that God trusted them with such important spiritual lessons. Anyone who questioned Samuel's doctrine was expelled from the community, shunned completely by their own families. 3 families tried to leave between 1996 and 1998. Samuel declared them covenant breakers, and told the remaining members that any contact with them would contaminate the sacred bloodline. Parents cut off their own adult children. Siblings stopped speaking. The fear of separation kept everyone else in line. But the most disturbing aspect of Samuel's program wasn't the marriages or even the genetic disasters. It was the children themselves, the ones who survived and appeared relatively healthy. Samuel was raising them in complete isolation, teaching them from birth that they were a superior race, that their unusual family structures were blessed by God, and that the outside world was evil and corrupt. These children had never been to a hospital, never seen a television, never met anyone who wasn't part of the compound. They were being shaped into true believers from their first breath. Former social worker Martha Kendrick, who would later investigate the compound, told authorities these weren't just isolated children. They were being systematically indoctrinated to believe that inbreeding was holy, that genetic disorders were gifts from God, and that they were destined to inherit the earth. Samuel was creating a second generation who would carry on his theology without question. That was perhaps the most terrifying part. He was building something that could outlast him. By the year 2000, the compound had grown to include 73 people across 3 generations. Samuel had begun arranging marriages for the first generation of compound. Born children, matching brothers with sisters, fathers with daughters, creating family trees that looped back on themselves in ways that geneticists would later describe as chromosomal catastrophes. The children born from these unions had genetic disorder rates of nearly 80%. Some didn't survive infancy. Others lived with conditions so severe that they required constant care. Yet Samuel pressed forward, more convinced than ever that he was on the verge of a breakthrough. He started calling the healthiest of the compound born children the pure ones, claiming they represented the first successful examples of his new race. He photographed them, measured their features, documented their development in journals that he said would one day prove to the world that he'd been right all along. The community's finances were straining under the medical needs of so many disabled children. But Samuel had developed new revenue streams. He'd started holding private conferences, inviting members of other fringe religious groups to the compound to hear his teachings. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they, too, believed in Christian identity, theology, and genetic purity. Samuel charged hefty fees for these conferences, and several attendees became donors, sending money to support what Samuel called the most important genetic experiment in human history. It was during one of these conferences in 2003 that Samuel made his most audacious claim yet. Standing before 30 visitors from various extremist religious groups, he gestured to a group of compound children and declared, "What you're looking at is the future of humanity. In 3 more generations, these children's descendants will be immune to disease, free from sin, and capable of miracles that haven't been seen since biblical times. They will be the humans God always intended us to be before Eve's sin corrupted our genetics. And when Christ returns, these will be the people he chooses to rule with him." The visitors didn't call the police. They applauded. The beginning of the end came from an unexpected source, a letter written by a 10-year-old girl. Her name was Rebecca Creech, Samuel's own granddaughter from a union between his son and daughter. Rebecca had been born with minor physical issues, a slightly malformed hand and a limp. But she was cognitively normal, and, more importantly, she'd been secretly taught to read by an older compound member who'd begun questioning Samuel's teachings. In 2008, during a rare supply run to town, Rebecca slipped a handwritten note into a donation jar at a gas station. The note read, "My name is Rebecca. I live with my grandfather Samuel Creech. He makes families marry each other. Lots of babies are born sick. Please help us. I don't know the address, but we're on the old Creech property past mile marker 17. A gas station clerk found the note 2 days later, and, uncertain what to make of it, gave it to a local sheriff's deputy. The deputy, Jake Morrison, had heard rumors about the Creech compound for years, but had never had cause to investigate. The note gave him that cause. Deputy Morrison drove out to the compound in early May 2008. What he found disturbed him enough to call for backup immediately. Through the fence, he could see multiple children playing in a yard, and several of them had visible deformities. When Samuel came to the gate, he was polite but firm. This was private religious property, and Morrison had no warrant. Morrison left but began building a case. The problem was jurisdiction and evidence. The compound straddled 2 counties, creating legal gray areas. The children were never seen outside the property, so no mandatory reporters like teachers or doctors ever had contact with them. The families had withdrawn from all government systems. No birth certificates, no social security numbers, no medical records. Legally, these children didn't exist. Morrison brought in the FBI, specifically their unit that handled religious extremist groups. Agent Sarah Vickers took on the case and spent 18 months building it methodically. She interviewed the 3 families who'd escaped the compound years earlier, documenting their stories of forced marriages and genetic disasters. She subpoenaed financial records, following the money trail from Samuel's conferences and donor networks. She consulted with geneticists who explained the mathematical certainty of genetic disorders in multi-generational inbreeding. But the breakthrough came from inside the compound itself. In November 2009, a woman named Hannah Creech, age 24, managed to escape with her 2 children during the night. Hannah was Samuel's niece and had been married to her own brother at age 16. Her 2 children, now 5 and 3, both had severe genetic disorders. The 5-year-old was deaf and had a cleft palate. The 3-year-old couldn't walk due to skeletal deformities and had cognitive impairments. Hannah's testimony was devastating. She described in detail how Samuel arranged marriages, how he instructed husbands on their sacred duty to produce as many children as possible, how he taught women that resisting their divinely appointed husbands was equivalent to resisting God. She explained the punishment system. Families who questioned Samuel were denied food rations, had their children taken away to be re-educated, or were locked in what Samuel called prayer rooms, small sheds where they'd be confined in darkness until they repented. Most chillingly, Hannah described Samuel's recent teachings. He'd begun telling the community that the end times were imminent, and that soon they'd need to defend their compound against the outside world. He'd been stockpiling weapons, training the men in tactical defense, and teaching the children that police and government officials were agents of Satan who would try to destroy God's chosen people. With Hannah's testimony, Agent Vickers had enough for a warrant. But she knew that executing it would be dangerous. This was a heavily armed compound full of true believers who'd been conditioned to see law enforcement as demonic enemies. One wrong move could turn into another Waco. The raid on the Hollow Ridge compound was planned with extraordinary care. Agent Vickers assembled a team that included FBI tactical units, child psychologists, medical personnel, and negotiators experienced with religious extremist groups. They spent weeks studying the compound layout, identifying escape routes, and preparing for multiple scenarios. On September 14, 2019, at dawn, the operation began. The approach was designed to be as non-confrontational as possible. No dramatic breach, no helicopters. Instead, agents simply drove up to the front gate in clearly marked vehicles and requested to speak with Samuel Creech. What happened next would be captured on multiple body cameras and eventually become part of the court record. Samuel came to the gate alone, dressed in white robes, completely calm. He smiled at the agents, as if he'd been expecting them. "You've come to witness the miracle," he said. "God told me you would come today. He told me it was time to show the world what he's created here." Agent Vickers tried to explain that they had a warrant to enter the property and check on the welfare of the children. Samuel just kept smiling. "Of course," he said. "Come in, come and see what God has wrought." He opened the gate himself. The agents entered cautiously, weapons ready but not raised. Samuel led them toward the main barn, talking the entire time. "You think you're here to rescue children," he said, "but you're actually here to witness the birth of a new humanity. Everything I've done, every sacrifice made, it's all been building to this moment. God's timing is perfect." When they reached the barn, Samuel pushed open the doors. That's when the officers saw the circle, 17 people, adults and teenagers, standing in perfect formation, completely still, staring forward with those disturbing, genetically damaged faces. In the center stood Samuel, still smiling that unnerving smile. "Officer," Samuel said to Deputy Morrison, who'd been included in the raid team, "you're interrupting the birth of God's chosen race." The psychological evaluation later performed on Samuel would reveal a man in the grip of complete delusional psychosis, possibly exacerbated by the fact that he himself was the product of first-cousin marriage and showed signs of genetic cognitive impairment. He genuinely believed, without any doubt, that he'd been chosen by God to create a superior human race through inbreeding. The raid took 7 hours. 43 children were removed from the compound, ranging in age from infancy to 17 years old. 26 of them showed signs of genetic disorders, from minor physical abnormalities to severe disabilities requiring immediate medical intervention. Medical examinations would reveal that the genetic damage in some family lines was so severe that doctors privately told investigators they'd never seen anything like it outside of medical journals documenting ancient royal dynasties. 19 adults were arrested on charges ranging from child abuse to statutory rape to conspiracy. Samuel himself faced 73 criminal counts, but the legal proceedings would prove complex and disturbing in their own right. The trial of Samuel Creech became a national sensation in 2020. Though much of the testimony was sealed to protect the identities of victims. Samuel's defense attorneys argued religious freedom, claiming that their clients' beliefs about marriage and family structure, while unconventional, were protected under the First Amendment. It was an argument that made prosecutors and victim advocates sick, but had to be taken seriously in court. The jury didn't buy it. In March 2021, Samuel Creech was convicted on 68 counts including child abuse, sexual assault of minors, and running a criminal organization. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He's currently housed in a maximum security prison in Kentucky, where reports say he continues to preach his theology to anyone who will listen, still utterly convinced that he was doing God's work. But the story doesn't end with Samuel's conviction. The 43 children removed from Hollow Ridge faced an almost impossible rehabilitation process. Most had never been to a doctor, never eaten food that didn't come from the compound, never interacted with anyone outside their cult. The oldest ones had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they fought their rescuers, begging to be returned to the compound, calling social workers demons and agents of Satan. The younger children, especially those with severe genetic disorders, required extensive medical intervention. Several underwent multiple surgeries. All needed therapy. Foster families had to be specially trained to handle children who'd been raised in such extreme isolation and abuse. As of 2025, most of the Hollow Ridge children are still in the care system, their identities protected, their futures uncertain. The adults who participated in Samuel's program faced varying sentences. Some, particularly the women, were considered victims themselves and received lighter sentences in exchange for testimony. Others, especially the men who'd participated in sexual abuse of minors, received decades in prison. Several remain free, their cases complicated by the argument that they were acting under religious coercion. Perhaps most disturbing is what happened to Samuel's teachings. Despite the horror of Hollow Ridge, fringe religious extremist groups continue to discuss his ideas online, debating whether his methods were flawed or whether he simply didn't have enough faith. Forums dedicated to Christian identity theology still reference his genealogical research. There are whispers of other small groups, inspired by Hollow Ridge, experimenting with similar ideas in even more isolated locations. The FBI now monitors these communities closely, but as Agent Vickers said in a rare interview, "You can't arrest ideology." Samuel Creech is in prison, but the ideas that drove him, ideas about genetic purity, about creating a superior race through religious justification, those ideas are still out there, and they're still attracting people who are desperate, isolated, and looking for something to give their lives meaning. That's what makes cases like Hollow Ridge so terrifying. It's not just about one man's madness. It's about how easily madness can spread when it's wrapped in religious language and promises of divine purpose. The Hollow Ridge stands empty now, the compound buildings slowly rotting back into the Kentucky hills. Local authorities have blocked the access road, and the property is technically still tied up in legal proceedings as victims' families file civil suits. Sometimes, late at night, neighbors report seeing lights on the property, though police investigations find nothing. Urban explorers claim the place is haunted, that you can still hear children crying in the abandoned cabins. But the real horror of Hollow Ridge isn't supernatural. It's the cold, documented reality of what happened there. It's the genetic damage that will echo through generations. It's the 43 children whose childhoods were stolen in the name of God. It's the proof that even in modern America, with all our systems and safeguards, people can still vanish into isolated communities where unspeakable things happen behind closed doors. And most terrifying of all, it's the knowledge that somewhere right now there might be another Samuel Creech, standing in another barn, in another forgotten corner of America, absolutely convinced that God is speaking to him, telling him to create something new, something pure, something that will change the world. The question that keeps investigators up at night isn't whether it could happen again, it's how many times it already is. If you found this story as disturbing as we did, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. We bring you the darkest true stories that mainstream media won't cover. Share your thoughts in the comments below, but please be respectful of the victims and survivors of Hollow Ridge. These were real people whose lives were destroyed by one man's delusion. Drop a like if you want us to cover more cases like this, and check out our playlist on religious extremism and isolated cult communities. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and remember, the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones in stories. They're the ones who convince you they're speaking for God.